At the height of $1 million meeting, a simple, poor boy surprises everyone by signing with the powerful businessman's deaf mother. An unexpected gesture that turns the tables, silences arrogance, and exposes a truth no one will ever forget. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel now to receive impactful stories that touch your heart every day. On that sunny New York morning, the atmosphere inside the imposing headquarters of Hamilton and Company was charged with luxury, ambition, and expectation. In the heart of a gleaming building with glass walls reflecting the city skyline, millionaire Richard Hamilton, a man in an impeccable suit, a gleaming Swiss watch on his wrist, and a cold, superior gaze, prepared to impress his most influential investors. It was a stage of power, where Richard's every calculated gesture exuded confidence and authority. But what no one imagined was that, within minutes, that same room would witness an event that would completely change the way everyone viewed the most feared man in the corporation. As the lawyers organized papers and the directors whispered details of million-dollar contracts, Richard seemed untouchable, a symbol of the arrogance that fed on the forced admiration of those around him. However, behind that ostentatious gleam lurked an uncomfortable truth, ignored by everyone there. His own mother, Margaret Hamilton, was present, sitting discreetly in a side chair, as if she were just another unimportant detail in the room. Deaf and silent, she watched her son conduct the meeting with aplomb, without even sparing him a glance. In that setting, everyone treated her as invisible, as if her presence held no value. It was at that moment, amid the clink of crystal glasses and footsteps echoing on the marble floor, that a side door opened unexpectedly. A young man of modest appearance entered, carrying a small bag. It was Daniel Carter, son of Helen Carter, the dedicated employee who worked every day at that company without ever being recognized. Dressed in modest school clothes and with a shy expression, Daniel had no idea that, upon crossing that door, he would forever change the course of that morning. Because, without realizing it, he carried something much greater than a simple lunch for his mother. He carried with him the spark of a gesture that would challenge the pride of an entire empire. Seated at the head of a solid oak table that seemed to stretch into infinity, Richard Hamilton exuded an almost overwhelming presence. Tall, with broad shoulders, perfectly aligned gray hair, and piercing blue eyes, his face bore a mixture of coldness and superiority that made anyone hesitate before speaking. The golden glow of the chandeliers reflected on his Italian silk tie, reinforcing the image of a man surrounded by wealth. His gestures were calculated. Each time he lightly tapped his gold ring on the table, silence fell, as if even the air around him obeyed his command. Richard was the embodiment of power, and he liked to make it clear that no one was his equal. While displaying impressive figures on graphs projected on the screen, he spoke of record profits and international expansion as if he were recounting a personal victory. His directors, eager for approval, nodded at every sentence, even without understanding all the details. Some investors chuckled, trying to please. Richard, for his part, observed every reaction like a predator assessing its prey. He knew how to manipulate glances, pause at the right moment, and even smile when he wanted to break the tension, though that smile always carried a hint of sarcasm. The entire room seemed to revolve around him, as if there were no room for anyone else. But what Richard didn't realize was that, behind this aura of perfection and absolute control, there was an invisible crack. In the background, his mother, Margaret, watched in absolute silence, and beside her, the young man who had just entered, Daniel, stared at the scene with a mixture of respect and discomfort. Richard's arrogance was so intense that it filled every corner of the room, suffocating even those who had nothing to do with the meeting. And yet, something in the air seemed about to snap, as if that exaggerated confidence were about to be challenged by something he could never have foreseen. In the corner of the room, almost hidden behind a curtain of indifference, stood Helen Carter, the maid who had dedicated her life to the Hamilton family for years. Dressed in her simple, muted blue uniform and pale gloves that still carried the scent of cleaning products, she stood erect, though her gaze betrayed weariness. Helen moved silently, collecting forgotten papers, discreetly arranging chairs, serving glasses of water with almost invisible gestures. To everyone there, she was nothing more than part of the furniture, someone who blended into the surrounding luxury without ever belonging to it. No one greeted her, no one thanked her, as if her existence were tolerated solely out of necessity for the service she provided. Richard, her boss, didn't even spare her a glance. While he talked about million-dollar figures, he didn't notice the presence of the woman who knew every detail of the house, where she grew up, who washed her clothes, who often reached out to her mother when he, too busy being powerful, didn't even remember her. The contempt was so natural that Helen had grown accustomed to living in the shadows, carrying on her shoulders the pain of indifference and the silent pride of not giving up, even in the face of disrespect. And in that room, surrounded by men and women in expensive suits, she seemed even smaller, as if the opulence of the place had the power to erase her humanity. But what Richard and his directors didn't know was that Helen wasn't alone. The newly arrived son, Daniel, observed every detail with attentive eyes. He noticed the way his mother was ignored, how her presence dissolved into the suffocating luxury of that room. And, within him, an uneasiness began to grow, though he couldn't explain it. There was something wrong with the scene, something cruel in the way everyone pretended his mother didn't exist. Little did he imagine that, in moments, that unease would transform into a gesture capable of shattering the arrogance that dominated the room and bringing to light a truth no one dared to see. The side door opened slowly, and for a moment the investor's buzz subsided, as if something unusual had invaded that shielded space of power. Daniel Carter, 15, entered with measured steps, holding a simple plastic bag in his hands. His brown hair was slightly disheveled, his school bag slung over one shoulder, and his worn, light blue shirt bore the marks of an ordinary day of school. He seemed out of place, as if he had mistakenly crossed the border between two worlds, the simple world he lived in and the cold world of millionaire luxury. Daniel, however, knew exactly why he was there, carrying the lunch his mother had forgotten at home. But he had no idea that this ordinary gesture was about to unleash something grand. Some directors' eyes lifted in disapproval, as if the presence of an ordinary boy were a mistake that marred the formality of the occasion. One of the lawyers, uncomfortable, cleared his throat, while Richard frowned slightly, still not giving due importance to the interruption. To him, Daniel was just another shadow, a weightless, voiceless intruder, the son of the woman who cleaned his offices. But for Helen, who flinched discreetly when she saw her son enter, that moment brought a mixture of pride and fear. Pride for the son who never left her alone, and fear of what might happen if Richard became irritated by her involuntary boldness. Daniel, oblivious to the discomfort he was causing, walked over to his mother and handed her the bag with a quick smile, as if simply fulfilling his duty. But his eyes wandered beyond her, exploring the environment he rarely saw. It was then that his gaze met that of Margaret Hamilton, Richard's deaf mother, sitting silently, almost invisible, in the corner of the room. The two exchanged a gesture of recognition, an unexpected connection that no one immediately noticed. And though Daniel didn't know it, that silent encounter was about to change not only the meeting, but the fate of everyone there. While most in the room returned their attention to the numbers Richard was projecting on the screen, Daniel Carter stopped to notice something no one else seemed to notice. In the corner, discreetly positioned near the glass wall, stood Margaret Hamilton, a woman with gray hair tied back in a simple bun, a sober dress, and her hands resting in her lap. The delicate features of her face carried the serenity of someone who had faced much more than life in silence. In Daniel's eyes, however, there was no weakness in her, but a restrained strength, a dignity that contrasted with the indifference of everyone around her. He realized that, despite being the mother of the most powerful man in the room, she was isolated, as if she were an uncomfortable detail in a luxurious setting. Richard spoke loudly, gesturing in front of the projection, completely absorbed in the need to impress the investors, but he didn't notice his own mother's eyes wandering around the room, finding no welcome. No one spoke to her. None of the directors included her in their conversations, and not even Richard had paid her any attention since she'd entered. Margaret seemed invisible like Helen, invisible like everyone outside the circle of power. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. He recognized in that solitary silence something he knew well, the feeling of being unseen, of being valued only for the service one provided. It was at that moment, as the world of business took precedence over human relationships, that Daniel and Margaret's eyes met. For a brief second, time seemed to stand still. The woman's eyes shone with surprise and tenderness, as if someone had finally recognized her. And in that meeting of glances, a silent bond was born, an understanding that needed no words. Daniel couldn't explain it, but he felt he had to act, that something bigger than himself was about to happen. A simple gesture could transform that forgotten moment into something indelible from everyone's memory. Daniel took a deep breath, as if searching for courage in a secret place within himself. He hadn't planned anything, simply following his heart's impulse. Unconcerned by the curious glances that were beginning to notice his presence, the boy walked to where Margaret Hamilton was sitting. He approached slowly, respectfully, and then did something no one in the room could have predicted. He raised his hands and, with firm, natural movements, greeted her in sign language. "Good morning, ma'am. It's a pleasure to meet you." The gesture, simple and genuine, broke through the invisible barrier that kept her isolated and brought light to her tired eyes. Margaret, surprised, took a moment to believe what was happening. For years she had grown accustomed to being ignored, even in front of crowds. But now, in front of everyone, a humble teenager, the son of the Maid, gave her the respect that not even her own millionaire son had thought to offer. Her lips trembled in an emotional smile, and her trembling hands responded with signs of gratitude and joy. For her, that moment wasn't just a gesture of communication, it was a restoration of dignity, a reminder that there was still someone willing to see her as a human being. The room, however, reacted unexpectedly. Conversations abruptly ceased, glasses froze in midair, and even Richard's fingers, which seconds before had been gliding over the pages of a contract, froze on the table. The room, previously dominated by the millionaire's imposing voice, was filled with absolute, almost solemn silence. It was as if everyone had witnessed something forbidden, something no one dared imagine possible in that space. And, amidst that silence, the contrast became unbearable. Daniel's humility illuminated Margaret's forgotten greatness, while Richard's arrogance began, little by little, to lose its luster. Margaret Hamilton's eyes filled with tears, but not of sadness. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of an unexpected joy that burst forth in silence. For years, she had grown accustomed to being an ignored presence at her son's gatherings, a forgotten face amidst figures and contracts. But now, in front of everyone, a young man who owed her nothing, who wasn't part of her circle or her fortune, offered her something she never expected to receive there: respect. With trembling hands, she responded to Daniel Carter's signals, her expression softened by the genuine smile that spread across his face. The gesture did not go unnoticed. With every move Margaret made, the entire room seemed to lean in to watch, as if witnessing a scene impossible to ignore. The directors, accustomed to the coldness of business, exchanged uneasy glances, unable to hide the emotion rising within them. Some shifted in their chairs, others discreetly pressed their lips together, as if trying to prevent their surprise from becoming words. The atmosphere, once so rigid, now seemed suspended by an invisible thread connecting the humble boy to the deaf woman, in a spectacle of humanity no one there expected to witness. And in the center of it all, Margaret seemed to blossom. Her eyes shone in a way they hadn't in a long time, as if Daniel's gesture had awakened something dormant within her. It was as if someone had finally broken the wall of silence surrounding her, giving her back the voice that had never been heard in that room. And as her hands continued to move in signs, thanking him, smiling, expressing what words couldn't, an invisible tension built. What would happen when Richard realized the boy had done what he had never been able to do? The room, previously filled with firm voices, papers being shuffled, and glasses clinking discreetly, was filled with a silence so profound it seemed impossible for such a crowded room. What began as a simple gesture between a humble boy and a forgetful woman turned into a scene capable of paralyzing executives accustomed to million-dollar figures and relentless decisions. One by one, eyes shifted from the projection of shimmering graphs to Daniel and Margaret, as if everyone suddenly realized there was something more important than contracts and numbers. Even the lawyers, always so attentive to every detail, remained motionless, unable to interrupt the spontaneity of that moment. Tension hung in the air as if it could be touched. The directors looked at each other, unsure how a mere teenager had managed to capture all the attention in a room dominated by the millionaire's power. It wasn't just the gesture itself, but the quiet courage he carried. It was as if Daniel had done what everyone, on some level, knew was necessary, but none of them would have dared give voice to those who had been silenced by arrogance and oblivion. And in that silence, something began to shift. The power that had always emanated from Richard seemed to shrink, losing strength in the face of a boy who, ironically, sought nothing more than respect. Richard, however, remained seated at the head of the table, his fingers immobile on the oak top, his jaw clenched, and his eyes fixed on the scene. With each passing second, he felt control slipping from his grasp, something he had never allowed in his own company. His breathing quickened slightly, and his previously unshakable expression began to show signs of irritation. But no one dared speak, no one dared laugh, not even cough. The silence that fell over the room wasn't just an absence of sound. It was collective judgment, it was discomfort, it was the realization that something extraordinary was happening. And Richard knew that. No matter how hard he tried to regain control, the room was no longer his. Richard Hamilton discreetly clenched his fists under the table, trying to maintain the facade of confidence that had always defined him. But inside, something burned. The scene before him was unbearable. His own mother, whom he always treated as a mere figurehead, was smiling radiantly at the maid's son. And worse than that, all eyes in the room were on them, not him. Richard, accustomed to being the center of attention, felt for the first time out of place within his own empire. That simple, almost banal gesture had robbed him of authority in a way that no competitor, no scandal, and no financial crisis ever could. He took a deep breath and forced a cold smile, trying to turn the situation into a joke. He tapped his pen lightly on the table and muttered something like, well, let's not waste time with nonsense." But his voice, which had previously dominated the room, sounded fragile, almost artificial, as if it no longer carried the same weight. Margaret's gaze, firm and full of pride for Daniel, cut through her son's arrogance like an invisible blade. And as Richard tried to regain control with his haughty posture, the tension grew. as everyone there clearly realized that that smile was nothing more than a cracked mask. For a man like Richard, the loss of control was worse than any business defeat. He knew investors were watching every detail, and the mere thought of being seen as weak or vulnerable sent him into panic. But the more he tried to regain his bearings, the more the contrast became clear. His arrogance seemed small compared to the unexpected greatness of a boy who had merely recognized a forgotten woman. The millionaire's pride was wounded, and within him grew a silent fury that could explode at any moment. And if it did, what followed could be even more devastating. The heavy silence that gripped the room began to be broken by small whispers, almost imperceptible at first, but which soon spread like an electric current among the investors. Men and women in impeccable suits leaned toward each other, murmuring short phrases, exchanging glances filled with amazement and curiosity. This wasn't part of the script. They had come to hear about profits, expansions, and million-dollar acquisitions, but unexpectedly, they found themselves witnessing a scene that said much more about character than business. The simple gesture of a young boy, socially ignored, revealed a stark contrast. The coldness of the millionaire they so admired and the genuine humanity that came from where they least expected it. Some investors, who until then had seen Richard as a model of strength and leadership, began to doubt. It was impossible not to compare the host's arrogance with the boy's sweetness and the deaf mother's emotion, which now seemed to shine brighter than any slide on the screen. One of the older men, known for his discretion, shook his head silently, as if reflecting deeply on the scene. One of the women, a prominent investor, placed her hand on her chin, assessing not only Richard's reaction but also the perception of the others. Doubt settled in like a stain spreading in water. Was this really the leader worth blindly trusting? Richard noticed every movement, and it was like salt in a raw wound. He felt the heat rise in his face and the weight of dozens of eyes judging him, no longer for his impeccable presentation, but for the way he ignored his own mother. It was as if, in a matter of minutes, his carefully constructed image was beginning to crumble. He tried to speak again, but each attempt was drowned out by the gazes that never left the scene between Margaret and Daniel. And what Richard couldn't admit aloud, but already knew deep down, was that he was losing not only the attention of the room, but also the silent respect of the men and women who supported his fortune. While the investors' murmurs still echoed through the room, Daniel Carter did something no one expected. He wasn't just communicating with Margaret Hamilton using sign language, but now he began translating aloud every delicate gesture she made with her hands. His youthful voice, still undergoing transformation, sounded firm, clear, and surprisingly confident, breaking the uncomfortable silence that hung over the room. "My son talks about numbers, but forgets about people. I just wanted to be heard." The words, which until then would have remained trapped in Margaret's silent world, now echoed before directors, lawyers, and incredulous investors. It was as if the entire room had stopped to hear a truth no one dared speak. Margaret, moved, continued signing, and Daniel, without hesitation, continued translating. "It's not profits that define greatness, but how we treat others." Each translated sentence was like an invisible arrow that struck straight to the hearts of those present. Some investors looked away, embarrassed. Others stared at Richard with expressions of disapproval. The woman, who had always been ignored, finally had her voice amplified by someone who wasn't even part of that world of power. And what was most impressive was that this someone wasn't seeking applause, simply conveying her point with loyalty and respect. Richard, unable to bear the scene, tried to interrupt with forced coughs and light taps on the table, but nothing could override that improvised translation. For the first time, his rehearsed speech was silenced by simple words born from his own mother's soul. Daniel, with the naturalness of someone who simply did what he thought was right, gave Margaret back something Richard had never given her, a voice. And, all the while, everyone in the room began to see the millionaire in a new light, no longer as an unshakable leader, but as a man who, even surrounded by wealth, failed in the most basic act of humanity. Richard Hamilton felt the weight of the words hammering at his own authority. It was as if each sentence Daniel translated was a mirror held before him, reflecting the truth he had spent his entire life trying to hide, his inability to recognize and value his own mother. He straightened his suit, adjusted his tie, and tried to smile, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. His once impenetrable expression now showed clear cracks, revealing the discomfort gnawing at him. The millionaire, so accustomed to controlling the narrative, found himself vulnerable before an audience that no longer seemed willing to applaud him blindly. The directors, who had previously laughed at his jokes and clapped at every chart he presented, now exchanged awkward glances. Richard's mask of confidence was clearly beginning to crack. He cleared his throat, tapped his ring lightly on the table, and murmured, "Very nice, but let's get back to the point." His voice sounded forced, lacking its former command, and the silence that followed only heightened the feeling that he had lost control. Margaret, beside Daniel, stood firm, her eyes fixed on her son, as if silently saying everything his hands had already signaled. The contrast was stark, the millionaire's emotional fragility versus the unexpected strength of a humble teenager. Each second dragged on like an eternity for Richard. He felt exposed, watched, judged. He knew that in that room, reputations were worth more than fortunes, and his was being eroded before everyone's eyes. The mere fact that his mother needed someone else to be heard revealed to the world his innermost neglect, a flaw that no amount of money could conceal. With every glance that fell upon him, Richard felt the investor's trust slipping through his fingers. And, no matter how hard he tried to regain his composure, something inside him knew that control was no longer his, and perhaps never would again. As Richard struggled to maintain his mask of power, Margaret Hamilton rose slightly in her chair, as if to prove she still had presence, that she still had something to say to the world. Her tear-filled eyes fixed on her son, not with hatred, but with the silent pain of years of contempt. Calmly, she moved her hands again in signs, and Daniel Carter, attentive, again translated in a clear voice. Greatness is not measured by what you possess, but by how you treat those who have always been by your side. The sentence cut through the air like a sharp blade, leaving the investors motionless. It was impossible to ignore the power contained in that truth. These weren't just words. They were a mother's entire life summed up in a plea that exposed the soul of a man who had always thought himself untouchable. Daniel, still standing beside her, seemed larger than he was. His eyes shone with courage, and his voice, despite his youth, sounded firm and charged with conviction. He added nothing, invented nothing, simply faithfully reproducing what Margaret expressed, but each sentence carried the weight of a revelation. It was as if she had finally regained the voice that had been taken from her for years, and this in front of the elite who had always ignored her. Some directors lowered their heads, unable to hold the woman's gaze. Others, however, stared at Richard with a mixture of disapproval and curiosity, waiting to see how he would react to such a simple yet devastating truth. Richard, for his part, couldn't move. His heart was pounding, his hands were slightly sweating, and his mind was racing for a quick response, but no amount of rhetoric could erase the impact of what his mother had just said. The force of truth was there, raw and unvarnished, and no fortune, no contract, no number could compete with it. The arrogance that had sustained him for so many years was crumbling, and the cruelest thing was realizing that it wasn't an external enemy destroying him. It was his own mother, with the help of a boy he'd considered irrelevant until that moment. And, silently, everyone awaited the next move, aware that nothing would ever be the same again. The room, filled with a dense silence, felt like an invisible courtroom. No words were spoken, but every look directed at Richard Hamilton carried the weight of a sentence. Investors, accustomed to seeing him as an unshakable leader, now regarded him with suspicion, as if the mask had finally slipped, revealing a man incapable of seeing what mattered most. The distant hum of the air conditioning was the only noise, accompanying the meaningful exchange of glances. There was no longer any doubt that everyone was passing judgment, even without needing to speak. It was the most devastating kind of judgment, the silent one, impossible to refute. Some directors looked away, embarrassed, but others regarded Richard with a coldness that until then only he had demonstrated. It was as if, for the first time, he was tasting his own medicine, the indifference of those who had grown tired of feigning admiration. The contrast was cruel. While Daniel, a teenager in simple clothes, gained the respect of the room simply for his authenticity, Richard was slowly losing the trust of the people who supported his fortune. The scene was too clear to ignore. There were no more graphs, projections, or figures that could reverse the impression formed there. Richard tried to compose himself, lifting his chin and pressing his lips together, as he did in tense business situations. But this time, there was no negotiation. The judgment that was being made wasn't about numbers, but about character. And he knew he was being defeated on a field he'd never prepared to fight. With every second, the silence grew more unbearable, and the millionaire felt that if he didn't act soon, he would lose not only the meeting but something much greater, the very image of authority he had spent years building. Yet any word he uttered at that moment would sound like desperation, and perhaps that was exactly what was about to happen. The silence that had suffocated the room was broken unexpectedly. One of the oldest investors, a white-haired man with a firm gaze and known for rarely speaking in meetings, slowly stood up. The movement was enough for all eyes to turn to him expectantly. He stared at Richard for a few seconds, as if weighing every detail of the scene he had just witnessed, and then said in a deep, measured voice, "This boy showed more greatness in one gesture than you, Richard, in all your arrogance." The words cut through the air like a lightning bolt, bringing to the surface what many had already been whispering silently, but no one had the courage to voice. The reaction was immediate. Some investors nodded in agreement, others murmured among themselves, and even the directors, always wary of contradicting their boss, couldn't hide the impact of the statement. The presence of Daniel and Margaret, side by side, seemed to illuminate the room with a truth no one could deny. Richard, on the other hand, stood still, as if he'd been dealt an unexpected blow in the midst of battle. His eyes scanned the faces of everyone around the table, but found no support, only looks laden with judgment and disapproval. The weight of the statement echoed, completely shattering the aura of power he'd tried to maintain. Richard's heart raced, but he couldn't tell if it was anger, shame, or fear. He tried to form a response, but his throat tightened. For the first time, the confidence that had always been his most lethal weapon failed. He, who could command entire rooms with just his voice, now found himself reduced to silence, defeated by the truth of a simple gesture. The climax had arrived. The empire of respect and fear he had built was beginning to crumble before a humble boy, a forgotten mother, and an investor who dared to voice the truth everyone could see. The question hanging in the air was inevitable. How would Richard react to this blow in front of everyone? The room remained silent, as if everyone was waiting for a reaction that never came. Richard Hamilton, paralyzed in his own leather chair, had a rigid face, but his eyes betrayed the inner storm that consumed him. For the first time, the millionaire seemed small within his own room, unable to sustain the image he had cultivated for years. The empire of arrogance he had built was shattered by something as simple as the courage of a humble boy. And while he silently struggled against his own downfall, Daniel Carter stood erect beside Margaret, who held his hand firmly, as if to immortalize that moment when she had finally been heard. The investors began to rise, one after another, unhurriedly, but with a clarity in their eyes. They had witnessed something worth more than any financial report. It wasn't about contracts, mergers, or astronomical figures. It was about respect, about humanity, about a gesture that dismantled the most solid arrogance they had ever seen. Some approached Daniel and Margaret, offering discreet nods of approval, while Richard, motionless, watched everything unfold, unable to regain control. The power was no longer in his hands. That moment didn't belong to the millionaire. It belonged to a woman who had been silenced and the boy who had given her back her voice in front of everyone. And so, the meeting that was supposed to be another triumph for Richard ended unexpectedly, marked not by numbers or corporate victories, but by an act of humanity no one would ever forget. The final silence wasn't empty, but charged with meaning, as if everyone knew they'd witnessed something that would change them forever. What about you? In Daniel's shoes, would you have the courage to face an entire room and restore dignity to someone who'd been forgotten? Stories like this remind us that true greatness is born from the simplest gestures. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and share this video. Because sometimes, it's in the unexpected that we find life's most powerful lessons. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell. Like and share this video so more people can be moved and reflect on these messages. Together, we will share stories that inspire, transform, and prove that hope can come through anyone, and teach us that we should never underestimate anyone. Thank you for your support.